Okay, so in this slideshow, I just want to talk a little bit about aquatic biomes, both freshwater and marine. And we're going to just start talking about what are they, what are some terminology we use, and a little bit about their characteristics. As we go through this unit, we're going to focus more on their environmental aspects. So let's start with freshwater systems. And one of the things we'll think about as we talk about freshwater is what is the availability of fresh water to us? So this is an important source of our drinking water, obviously. You might want to go back and review the water cycle a little bit. So thinking about how water cycles from the atmosphere to surface water, groundwater, ocean, how does that all take place? And then the water available to us as fresh water is going to be predominantly in rivers and streams, wetlands, lakes and ponds, groundwater. And then all of that is unequally distributed. So some areas are going to have a lot more availability of water than others. So where is Earth's water? So as I said, only a small percent is actually fresh water. Most of it's tied up in the oceans. So this is salty water that's mostly undrinkable. And so we're really focused on fresh water. And of that 2.5% of fresh water, most of it's tied up in glaciers and ice caps. Some of it's in groundwater, so this may be accessible, but it sort of depends on where it is and how easy it is to get to. And then surface water is only 1.2% of that 2.5%. So it's just a small amount. And then even that, a lot of it's ground ice and permafrost. So the amount that we can use for our purposes is actually pretty small. And so freshwater biomes are going to be a vital resource for drinking water. And as we just said on the previous slide, freshwater is unequally distributed. So this is one of the major concerns is trying to figure out for a lot of countries how to get drinking water to their people. So in some cases, it's the countries live in dry areas where maybe they get very little rain or the rain is seasonal. So they have to figure out how to make fresh water available. Other countries might not have the infrastructure, so there might be fresh water, but if you don't have pipes or water treatment plants, then you don't have the ability to get fresh water that's safe for drinking to your population. So we'll come back to thinking about some of those issues. All right, so let's first start talking about rivers and streams. And these are really the same thing. One's bigger than the other, and there's no particular dividing line between them. When we think of rivers and streams, we can think about the watershed. The watershed is all the land that contributes water to a given stream or river, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The floodplain is the area where a river might flood, so maybe seasonally or yearly, and that area is going to be very fertile because of the deposition of silt and sort of nutrient-rich sediments. And so that riparian or riverside forests are very productive. It's also been an area where agriculture has traditionally arisen because of that productivity, and it supports diverse ecological communities. If we look at the river on this picture, just to point out that rivers tend to meander, and they can also sort of change their course over time. So as there's erosion occurring or as storms maybe cut new channels, this river may not have the same pathway in 20 years as it does now. All right, and here's showing the Mississippi River watershed. So this is a huge watershed if you think of how much of the U.S. is actually a part of this watershed. And so here's the Mississippi River. And so the watershed of the Mississippi River is going to include all the water that empties into it. So if anywhere in this area it rains, water is going to run off into streams, which runs off into small rivers and then eventually into the larger rivers. And those rivers then meet up with the Mississippi. And all of that winds up being dumped in the Gulf of Mexico. Remember, we talked about dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So all of this runoff is also picking up things like fertilizer, industrial pollutants, pollutants from cars. Anything that's in this area is going to wind up running off in the water, is going to wind up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's one of the reasons we see those dead zones develop, because of all the fertilizer and nutrient runoff that's going to wind up there. And here's another view of the Mississippi River that's showing kind of the individual watersheds. So the watersheds are really defined by like what river you're talking about. So even though this whole thing is the Mississippi River watershed, you could also talk about the Ohio River, the Missouri River watershed as well. So it just depends on what your perspective is. All right, and then closer to home, this is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is also a fairly large watershed. And so when you think of, we often talk about pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. Well, part of the problem is that you have runoff from New York, Pennsylvania, right, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, all sort of meeting up in the Chesapeake Bay. So all of these areas might have to be regulated in some way if we want to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. And so dealing with all the different states and all the different types of pollution becomes part of the problem. All right, and this is just again showing that there might be different watersheds. So this is, if this is the ocean and we've got, what, 4 rivers here, this would be the watershed for this river. So it's all the inputs to that particular river. All right, then let's move on to lakes and ponds. So this is open standing water, okay? And again, lakes and ponds, same things with rivers and streams, just a size thing. We generally tend to call smaller areas ponds. One thing I want you to know with ponds is a little bit of the language when we talk about like where in the pond things are. So if we look at this diagram, here's sort of the edge of the pond. And so that edge where the water is just pretty shallow and meeting up with the land is called the littoral zone. I always remember this because I think there's litter around the littoral zone, but that's on the edge. And then as you go further out into the pond, you have the limnetic zone. So this is open water, and notice it's also where sunlight is penetrating. We also can call this area the photic zone. So photic means light. So this is the area where light penetrates. And so this is more productive too because you have algae that can be the base of the food chain. Underneath the limnetic zone is the profundal zone. This is darker, where light is not going to penetrate too well. And then the very bottom, so the surface here, the mud or the sand or silt on the bottom, is the benthic zone. Okay. We've talked a little bit about wetlands, but just a reminder and a couple more terms. So wetlands include marshes, swamps, and bogs. So marshes are areas where water and land meet. So if we think of, for instance, in Maryland, we have saltwater marshes where like the bay or the ocean is meeting land, and you have those really grassy, wet areas. So wetlands are going to have water for a large part of the year, standing water for large parts of the year. So marshes are again where water meets land. Swamps are similar, but these tend to be forested areas. So you have trees in the swamps, and the swamps are often identified by the type of tree that's there. And then finally, bogs. Bogs are areas that are found generally further north, like in boreal forest. And so they tend to have acidic water, and it tends to be things don't decay very well. So you wind up accumulating decomposing matter. And when we talk about coal, we'll talk about peat. And so peat basically accumulates in bogs. And so bogs are interesting in that they kind of won't necessarily look like they're water. They'll look kind of mossy, but if you start walking into them, you will sink. So that's what a bog is. So any of these areas combine fresh water and dry land. They're rich and productive areas, and they provide habitat for a lot of wildlife. They provide things for like migrating birds, for example. They're nurseries for a lot of fish and animals. And so all of these ecosystem services are provided by wetlands. They can slow runoff, reduce flooding. Since the water is standing there, it has a lot of time to infiltrate the soil so it can recharge aquifers. And it's also a good way to filter pollutants. So a lot of water treatment plants will now have artificial wetlands as part of the water treatment because water will be much cleaner as it exits the wetlands, as all the different vegetation pulls out that pollution. All right, so let's switch now to marine. So marine, we're talking saltwater or ocean ecosystems. So here we're going to think about the description, a little bit about importance and human impacts. And again, we'll kind of talk more about human impacts as we go through the unit. Just a bit of an aside about what the ocean is. So salt water is made up primarily of sodium chloride, table salt, okay? And we generally say that the ocean is about 3.5% salt. So remember, percent is per 100. An older way of saying this is saying parts per thousand. So think about this, is that if this is 3.5 parts per 100, that's going to be 35 parts per thousand, right? Because you multiply 100 by 10 to get 1,000. So 3.5 times 10 would be 35. All right, so again, it's mostly sodium and chloride with some other salts thrown in. And then there's nutrients that are dissolved. We talked about that. So nitrates, phosphates, iron, things like that. And then there are dissolved gases. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are dissolved in the ocean, as well as nitrogen. So here's a picture just showing some of the terminology when we think about different parts of the ocean, just like we just talked about different parts of lakes. So we still have, if we're thinking about land, we have the intertidal zone. That's the zone between the high and low tide. So it's partially submerged, at least for part of the day, and then dries out for part of the day. All right, the neritic zone is kind of like that zone that's right over the continental shelf. So it's shallower, and also highly productive because it's lots of light is penetrating this area. As we drop off, right, we're in the open ocean now. The top layer is the photic zone. So again, photic, that's where light is penetrating. And then beneath the photic zone, this whole area we could say is the aphotic zone. And if you ever looked, I think a few of you are taking marine science, you'll learn some very specific terminology for different layers of that. But for our purposes, photic and aphotic works well. And then the benthic zone, again, is the bottom. So what's living in or on this bottom surface. All right, and then the very deepest ocean is the abyssal zone. And this is just showing how light penetrates water. So if you remember from chemistry, water is made up of different wavelengths. So that's the rainbow colors, Roy G. Biv. But red and yellow actually don't get very far in the water. So they're pretty much absorbed in the first 50 meters or so. And then really blue and green are what penetrate the deepest. And so that's why everything kind of looks blue and green as you get deeper in the water. All right, the other thing to think about ocean waters besides light is temperature. So if you look at, let's take a look at this diagram. So this is depth. So up at the 0, let me see if I can put the pen on. Up at the 0, this is the surface. All right, and then this is the temperature. So if we think of polar regions, these are really cold. So notice that the temperature is not really changing with depth. So as we go from the surface, it gets a little bit colder, but then it's kind of consistent. All right. But as we get to temperate and tropical areas, we have warming at the surface, right? So here the temperature, tropical can be between, let's say, 23, 24 degrees Celsius. Temperate might be about 18 degrees Celsius. So it's warming at the surface. And then you have this area where it changes really quickly as you go down in depth. So that's the thermocline. And then once you're below a certain level, so let's say once you get to this 1,000 feet, then again, you just have that cold, deep water. Okay. This can set up some stratification, which we talked about when we talked about dead zones again. All right, in the open waters, just a little note about the food chain. So the base of the food chain are these small phytoplankton. So phyto means light. So these are our photosynthetic algae, bacteria. This is the base of the food chain. That's eaten by zooplankton. So these could be protists, larvae of different fishes, things that are basically very small, floating in the ocean. And these zooplankton, they get eaten then by the small fish. So being at the surface is kind of dangerous for them. So a lot of these undergo vertical migrations. So during the day, when the fish are out, they sink to the deeper ocean where there's not that many predators. And at night, they then rise to the surface where they can feed and there's not as many predators around. All right, when we think of biomes, one of the kind of most unique biomes is the deep ocean. So this is the aphotic zone. So if you think of the aphotic zone, it's going to be dark, it's going to be cold, and there's a lot of pressure. So fish have a lot of adaptations to deal with this. So the deep sea adaptations include things like bioluminescence. So if there's no light, you produce your own. This might be to help you identify others of your species, maybe to find a mate. Or it could be, in the case of this fish, there's a bioluminescent lure that he's basically using, or she's basically using as a fishing rod to lure in prey. They're going to have a reduced skeleton because there's so much pressure. Really, you wouldn't want bones. So they tend to be more cartilaginous and not really have that much. Finding mates in the deep ocean is going to be a problem. So in the case of this anglerfish, this is a female. Those are bigger. The males actually find a female, latch on, and then they become a parasite on the female. So that's one strategy to find a mate when there are not very many of them around. And then finding food, as I said, they have all these strange adaptations, such as this anglerfish. All right, kelp forests we've talked about. Remember we talked about sea otters? So these are these huge algae forests off the Pacific coast of the US, so in California. And you can see they provide all of this sort of habitat for fish and other things to live and hide within the kelp forest. So they can be really biodiverse. And that was the problem. Remember, we got rid of the otters and then the sea urchins proliferated and they ate all the kelp, and then all of a sudden the kelp forest disappeared, which means all the biodiversity disappeared. So this is an example of a healthy kelp forest. All right, and then we have coral reefs if we think of tropical regions. So coral reefs are the most productive of the ocean biomes. And just if you look at sort of the ecosystem here, so off the coast you have these coral reefs, but they're also really a part of this whole system where you have mangroves at the coast, maybe a lagoon with seagrass beds, and then the coral reefs kind of outside of that. So these are all really connected. And coral reefs are productive because the main organism that sort of forms the coral reefs are corals. So corals are actually a member of the same type of organism as jellyfish, except what they do is they're like anemones, but they secrete calcium carbonate shells. That calcium carbonate is what forms the reef. And the interesting thing about corals is just like jellyfish, they have these stinging tentacles, so they can hunt using their tentacles. So if little fish swim by or zooplankton, they can get caught in the tentacles and eaten. But they also have zooxanthellae or symbiotic algae that actually live within their tissues. So we say these are endosymbiotic. Dinoflagellate is just the type of algae. So they live inside the tissue. So the symbiosis is they use sunlight to produce food, just like all photosynthetic organisms. And so some of that excess food can be used by the coral, and that gives it enough energy to build those coral reef structures. And in return, the algae has a safe place to be, and it gets the waste products from the coral animal. So it's kind of this interesting symbiotic relationship that makes for a very productive ecosystem. All right, coral reefs are found in tropical zones, and because they have those photosynthetic algae, it needs to be shallow enough that light penetrates. So you find coral reefs in tropical regions near coast where there's warm water. So those three things have to be present, and you can see from this reddish indicators where coral reefs are located. Notice on the west coast, right, in the west coast, we don't see any coral reefs. Do you know why? So remember, this is the area where you have cold water upwelling. So water here, even though it's in the tropical regions, is going to be colder. So we only see the coral reefs on the eastern side of our country. All right, and these coral reefs, as I said, are really productive ecosystems. Just like the kelp forest, they provide lots of heterogeneity, so lots of places for fish to hide, to live, to hunt. And so that forms a base for a really rich food web and ecosystem. But unfortunately, coral reefs are really kind of in a precarious position nowadays. So elevated temperatures due to climate change can lead to things like coral bleaching. So if the temperature gets too high, those algae get expelled from the coral. And so we say that the coral bleaches because the algae was what was giving the coral its color. But without those algae, right, they're not making enough food to really form reefs. And if it's a really bad bleaching event, those corals die off. And once the corals die off, they're usually replaced by algae systems. And those are not going to be as diverse and not going to be as rich. There are also a variety of diseases that are affecting coral reefs. And overfishing changes the food web on the reef. So we've gotten rid of a lot of the big predator fish and a lot of the big herbivores. Again, if you get rid of the herbivores that would eat the algae starts to outcompete the coral. And then there's been a lot of pollution issues. Again, remember, coral reefs are coastal. So any runoff coming from development or farming or industry could affect those coral reefs. All right, the next area I want to talk about, intertidal. Remember, intertidal is the area between tides. So anything that lives in this zone is going to have to be adapted to maybe dry out during times of the day. Maybe that water gets hotter because there's things like tidal pools. What is living there might be crammed closely together, so you're sort of competing for space. And this is wavy. So there's a lot of wave action as waves hit the coastline. So a lot of these critters have mechanisms to hold themselves in place. Okay, so that's the intertidal area. When we think of intertidal, it kind of varies depending on where you are. So usually north in more cold environments, you'll see rocky intertidal areas, though these can be anywhere. But think of like coast of New England if you've ever been there. You have these rocky intertidal zones. And again, these are areas where you're going to have organisms that have to be adapted to these harsh conditions. So a lot of these are going to have shells so they can escape into if it dries out. They have ways to attach themselves to the surface. So if you think of things like clams and mussels that kind of can attach themselves to take advantage of that. As we move into more temperate areas, so again, think mid-Atlantic here. This is the Chesapeake Bay. We have salt marshes. So this is predominantly grassland areas that occupy this intertidal space. And then finally, in tropical areas, we have our mangroves or mangrove forest. And these are named after mangrove trees. So notice, again, these are depending on where they are, at least partially submerged. So they have to be tolerant of saltwater conditions, right? There's not a lot of oxygen, so they have to have very specific adaptations so that their roots can get enough oxygen and that they can anchor themselves in this substrate. And you can kind of see how these trees have all these roots that are anchoring themselves. And mangroves really perform vital functions in tropical areas. So they act as storm breaks, both for things going into land, right? They can break up the energy of wave action, for example. And if you have runoff coming from land, any sediment, it gets trapped in these mangrove areas. So these are actually land building areas as they trap that sediment, and they prevent it then from going further out. So here's a quote I like about from the Mangrove Action Project. So mangrove forests are one of the most productive and biodiverse wetlands on Earth, yet these unique coastal tropical forests are among the most threatened habitats in the world. They may be disappearing more quickly than inland tropical rainforests, and so far with little public notice. Healthy mangrove forests are a key to a healthy marine ecology. So remember that diagram I showed you, they're a part of that coral reef system. So if the mangroves fail, then that means you have more sediment and pollution that can hit the coral reefs. And these are also an area where a lot of fish, like the baby fish, wind up sort of growing to a larger size in this protected area. And this is just again showing our coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangrove systems, right? And how this sort of prevents some of the sediment from reaching the coral reef. And then organisms that live on the coral reef, a lot of their young wind up going either to the seagrass beds or the mangroves as young, or sometimes they'll go to the seagrass beds to hunt. And then this is just a picture of some mangrove areas, and you can see the sediment kind of around these areas that those mangroves are trapping. All right, and lastly, just to mention estuaries. So estuary is where freshwater meets saltwater, and you should be familiar with this because the Chesapeake Bay is an estuary. Sometimes we call that mix, where it's mixing brackish water. So brackish water, if you think about the Chesapeake Bay, it starts as fresh water up where the rivers dump into it, and then as you get closer to the ocean, it becomes saltier and saltier. Okay, and you can read about the Chesapeake Bay. I'm not going to read this word for word, but the Chesapeake Bay is a very productive estuaries. And in general, estuaries are going to support high biodiversity. The Chesapeake Bay supports about 350 species of fish and 170 species of shellfish. So economically, these are also very important areas. And some of the reasons for that, if you think about it, you've got this area where freshwater is meeting saltwater. So you have different types of fish and animals as you go from one region to the other. A lot of ocean-going fish may have part of their life cycle in the estuary. We have those marsh areas that fish and shellfish can hide in. And also the Chesapeake Bay is going to be warmer, shallower, light penetrates. So all of those things help keep it more productive. Okay, I droned on a little bit long, but hopefully you got the message, took some notes on some various types of ecosystems, and we will take it from there in class.